you hear me fine?
I can hear you great. Hopefully the stream can as well. So again, my name is John. This is the Academy Gaming Hour, where every week we play a different game, and we try to talk to different people throughout the industry. And today we are very honored to have Revolution Software's Charles Cecil. And
Well, John, thank you. I mean, normally I'd be pronounced as Cecil.
oh, Cecil, I'm so sorry.
No. Cecil is absolutely correct.
Oh, really?
For my American friends, normally I'll answer gladly to Chuck Cecil. I'll answer to any name.
Awesome. Well, again, we're very honored to have you on the Academy Gaming Hour this week. And for people that might not know who you are, could you give a little bit of background as to um, your, I guess, your background, your upbringing, and how you got into the gaming industry?
Oh, that's a long one. Yeah. I'm best known as the founder and CEO of Revolution, and we write adventure games. Our best known brand is Broken Sword. We recently kickstarted Broken Sword 5, and that was very successful. We raised $850,000 and had the huge pleasure and privilege to be able to communicate directly with 15,000 backers, which was just amazing.
Awesome.
But to go back, I actually wrote my first game for the Sinclair ZX81 in 1981.
Mm,
Um, so this particular glorious bit of hardware had 1K of memory. You could expand it to 16K.
mm,
I mean, obviously 1K now feels so extraordinary, but we were doing amazing things. I think in the US you probably had 64K. So we were looking across very enviously at you because 64K felt like so much memory. What on earth would you do with 64K? But the company that I was involved with, Arctic Computing, produced a chess program that ran in 1K, which is an extraordinary achievement,
mm,
absolutely extraordinary. And so I started writing text adventures for those very early computers. In those days, it was interesting because the US was very Commodore based, and Germany was Commodore based, and in the UK and France, we were Sinclair based.
mm.
So that's Sir Clive Sinclair who produced the Spectrum, the ZX Spectrum, the ZX81, and the ZX80. And and during the mid '80s, sorry, from the beginning of the 1980s, we were writing these games on the platform, and then everything sort of collided in the mid '80s when uh, we started having Commodores shipped in. We had Nintendo coming in, and everything changed. And suddenly, the market turned into a truly global one.
Mm.
Then I worked for a company called US Gold that was a publisher, and then Activision. And then in 1990, I had the opportunity to go back into development and founded Revolution. And that's what I've been doing for the last 25 years.
That's awesome. And today we're playing your latest game, as you said, which is the Kickstarted Broken Sword 5, episodes 1 and 2, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Awesome. And we'll get into more of the game as well as we're going along, but we'll be playing a little bit of the game in the background and really getting into it a little later on the stream. I guess one of the biggest thing is since you've been in the game industry for so long, what are some of the biggest changes you've seen from when you started to 2015?
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is that with the rise of mobile, in many ways, the rules that we'd learnt for fairly basic computers, like in particular the Amstrad and the Commodore 64, kind of came full circle because a lot of the gameplay elements became relevant again, both because of the technology and the resolution, but also a more casual audience.
Hmm.
So in many ways, everything goes full circle. Um, but when I started, there was absolutely, I mean, the cottage industry. There were very few companies. Was absolutely split between whether this was a fad like yo-yos and computer games would come and go,
Hmm.
or whether it would last as an industry. And the idea that we would overtake music in terms of revenues, the idea that we would challenge film and overtake box office would have been utterly unthinkable, utterly unthinkable. So
Hmm.
in some ways things go round. In some ways they're totally different. And from a technology perspective, of course, really the big jump was, I guess, the move to CD, where suddenly instead of having a floppy with 1.4 meg,
Mm.
you suddenly went up to hundreds and hundreds of meg. Um, but then the ability to communicate over the internet in multiplayer games, again, that was that I'm not sure that we would ever have seen that. So yeah, no, as I say, in some ways it's going full circle. In some ways, absolutely extraordinary change.
Awesome. Um, I guess also in terms of the method you've used to create Broken Sword 5, Kickstarter was a big thing as well that changed. How was that experience for you in the end, now that you're looking back on all that?
Yeah, Kickstarter was very interesting. The reason that Kickstarter as a whole came about was because, well, certainly a lot of the publishers that we worked with, and we worked with some really good ones
Mm.
and some really bad ones. But the bad ones tended to, the senior management were out of touch with gamers.
Mm.
Basically, there was one particular publisher, and the guy who was the chief executive was very proud of the fact he'd never played a video game,
Mm.
and he thought that that's what basically made him make what he thought were great decisions. I mean, the company ultimately collapsed pretty quickly
Mm.
because he was just out of touch. But one of the things they decided very quickly was the move to 3D was going to alienate an audience that wanted to play adventure games.
Mm.
And it became a self-fulfilling prophecy because publishers wouldn't fund them. Retailers thought that they felt old-fashioned. So they kind of fell out of favor, and without publisher support, without retailer support, it was impossible to write.
Mm.
And clearly, adventures are a niche, but they're a very large niche.
Mm.
And we were actually unable to really know the size of the market or the level of passion that there was for the games that we wrote. And then Apple came along in 2007 and produced the iPhone and invited us to write some of our adventures.
Mm.
So we first of all ported one of our early adventures called Beneath the Steel Sky, and that did really well. And we got a sense of actually our audience because we invited people to things like the launch.
Mm.
We were lucky enough to have that at the Apple Store in London. And as time went by, and as we did more and more of these things, so we started gathering a community of really hardcore backers, fans
Mm.
who were just fantastic. And that gave us enormous confidence. And then we produced Broken Sword 1 on iPhone.
Mm.
And Apple, who were a pleasure to work with, who are a pleasure to work with, featured it. And bearing in mind that we're a really small developer, it blew our minds when they featured it on something called the 12 Days of Christmas.
Mm.
And we had 2.5 million downloads in one day,
Nice.
which that blew up all our servers. Broken Sword went into the top 10 most tweeted keywords in the world on that particular day.
Mm.
It was really on that day that it really struck home that everything had changed.
Yeah.
Everything had changed. And that as a small developer, we were now on a level playing field. We went up against Monkey Island, a great game. When they ported to mobile, they focused on the graphics, we focused on the UI. We got an average Metacritic of 91, they got a Metacritic in the 70s because ultimately we'd made the right choices, and according to the reviewers at least, they'd made some wrong choices. But it was extraordinary that a small team of really just 4 or 5 people, as we were then, could compete directly with LucasArts and come out on top. And that was just fantastic. So that then gave us the confidence to start writing, and also the funding to start writing a new Broken Sword, a 5th Broken Sword game. And we had the resources to produce a prototype, which took us about 3 or 4 months. And then, as we knew we would, we ran out of money. And a number of other games companies, most notably Double Fine, had kickstarted their projects. Now, Double Fine had said, look, we want to write a game with you. And obviously, Tim Schafer had, and the Monkey Island label and all the other games that he and the company are associated with, gave them the kudos to be able to say, we don't know what we're going to write, but we're going to do it with you. And they were very successful. I felt that we had to come up with a slightly different approach, and that is, we're going to write a new Broken Sword game. It's going to look like this.
Hmm.
The story is basically this, and if you don't support it, then that's fine. But the game won't ever get produced, which was absolutely the case.
Hmm.
And one of the things I'm quite proud of is the movie that we came up with. I thought very hard about what the messages that we wanted to convey were, and they included, George and Nico are back. They're the protagonists of Broken Sword. This is going back to 2D, hand-drawn backgrounds. That we bring forward the level of humor. That we've got the jeopardy. So all of these things sort of fed into this video that we put together very, very cheaply.
Yeah.
But it kind of worked, and people use it now as a template for best practices on how you actually communicate. And the video slipped. We intended to release it in July, and then we didn't finish it in time. And by extraordinary good fortune, there's a sort of an expo called Gamescom that happens every year in Cologne in Germany. And all the European and a certain number of American press are there. And the campaign, because we hadn't finished the video, slipped to just beyond Gamescom.
Mm-hmm.
So I had this wonderful opportunity to meet all the journalists and show them what we were doing, and ask them to embargo their story. And by embargo, basically we were asking them not to print anything until we were ready. And that works very well. Everybody was happy to do that. So when we did finally launch, which was about a week after Gamescom, there's this tsunami of press. And we had a goal of $450,000. And we reached a third of it within the first day. And that was fantastic because it took all the stress off. And it meant really we could just then have fun, because we had this extraordinary month where we were communicating directly with our fans, directly with the potential backers and the backers. Because of the jeopardy, the hardcore backers got really excited and really evangelized on our behalf. And it was an extraordinary month. It was just a pleasure to be able to communicate directly in the way. I mean, it reminded me in many ways of the very early days in the early 80s, because we used to go to what were called microfairs. And at those microfairs, 2 or 3 times a year, we'd actually meet our audience. We'd get to talk to them, and we'd hear what they liked and what they didn't like. And then as time went on and publishers became more powerful and retailers became more powerful, so our direct relationship with our audience diminished until, by the sort of late 80s, there was absolutely no way that we communicated directly with anybody at all, because that relationship clearly was a very valuable one from a commercial perspective. So it was wonderful through the Kickstarter process to be able to re-engage. And now through social media, we have, I'd like to think, a very good relationship. We delivered the game, and people came back to us and said they were thrilled. It was exactly what we said we'd do. We've got actually just one digital reward still to give out, which is the director's commentary, which I think most people have forgotten about, but we haven't, because we want to make sure that everything that we promise to deliver, we will deliver, and we're in the process of putting that together, and then there's some notes as well which I need to put together, But as I say, most people, nobody's chasing us on us anymore. But for us, it's very important that we fulfill all the promises that we made, and then we will have done it. And I'm very proud of the relationship that we've built. I'm very proud of the fact that the whole team, came together to write a game. We responded to what people had to say, right back in the early days when we'd released the video. A number of people came back and made comments. They said that our protagonist, George, his chin wasn't quite right in the model. And they were absolutely right, so we changed it. And we found ourselves in this sort of virtuous cycle, in that we were delighted to get the feedback. Our fans were delighted that we were listening to them. And everybody won, because we were genuinely taking on board what people had to say. And for us, it was very valuable to hear, because we knew that by listening to these comments, we would be able to write a game that ultimately would fulfill the desires of adventure fans.
I think there's a lot of topics to talk about, but I think one of them, I'm just curious about to hear your thoughts, are the current state of Kickstarter and Indiegogo. You talked a lot about the success of Broken Sword. What do you think other Kickstart games should be looking towards that really brought about the success of your game?
Well, in some ways it was easier when we did it. In some ways harder.
Mm,
It was certainly harder because we had very, very few examples of successful Kickstarter campaigns. And as I say, Double Fine's one where they said, "Look, we're going to write a game with you,"
mm,
which clearly we were not going to do the same thing. Also, from a UK perspective, you had to have a company based in the US with a driving license
mm,
and Amazon and an Amazon account, and that created some hurdles as well. But we overcame those. Since then, of course, the popularity of Kickstarter and Indiegogo has grown enormously. But then there's a degree of fatigue, and there have been some appalling campaigns.
mm,
There have been some campaigns within games that border on fraud,
mm,
and it was quite clear that because it was so open that it was going to be open to abuse, and that there were going to be some big falls, and some of those have happened, and some of those will continue to happen. The point I think underlying all of this is that there's a huge desire of fans to apps to have a part of to be a part of the development,
mm,
and so it certainly isn't going to go away. What'll happen is it'll just morph into morph in response to the situation. The great thing is that things are so fluid, and they are being molded by crowd responses
mm,
that the right thing will happen. The changes will happen for the right reason.
mm,
But it was quite clear that fatigue was going to happen, and it was quite clear that some horrible campaigns were going to go wrong, as indeed they did.
mm. I see. I guess another comment about that as well, or question is, with your game as well, you said that Apple and the mobile revolution was a big impact on, Broken Sword 5 and all these other games. Um, do you think that you'll be continuing to make games for the mobile platform and for, all platforms as well?
Well, we are very lucky with point and click in that it translates well from mouse to touch,
Mm-hmm.
and to joypad, because the game was released on PlayStation 4 and Xbox One,
Mm,
and the controls just work across all platforms. Across all those formats. It's actually, we're very lucky in that regard. But to answer your question directly, a lot of people complain about Apple in particular.
mm,
Um, we are at one end now. Flurry released some figures talking about, pointing out that 90+% of revenues come from free to play,
mm,
and that 8 of the remaining percent is at 99 cents. We're $10, so we are so far above that. We are taking a tiny proportion of that 1%
mm,
that remains. But the market is so big that we're very happy to have a big percentage of that tiny share, because ultimately we are selling to people and we're saying, that the first part is $5 on mobile, the second part is $5. If you want us to continue writing adventure games, then you need to buy the game.
mm,
And we're very grateful to you when you do. If you want to pirate it, then that's obviously your choice.
mm,
But by depriving a developer of the revenues that they deserve, for writing a game, then it means that we won't be able to survive and go forward, because adventure games in particular are very expensive to write. So
mm,
we do absolutely count on the goodwill of our fans to legitimately buy the game, and we're very grateful to them when they do.
mm. And maybe this is just a curious question. I don't know if you know the analytics behind it. Do you know how many new fans you're getting reaching out to versus like returning fans of the Broken Sword series to these games? Do you know if you're reaching a bigger fan base?
Well, there are two kinds of there are two groups. Obviously, there's the new fans, and there are a lot of young people coming in, particularly through mobile,
Mm-hmm.
and then the originals. And it's difficult to tell which, the numbers of both.
Mm,
But we're delighted by the way that it's grown. As I say, adventures are a niche, but they're a very sizable niche.
Mm.
So we feel that we're in a good position.
Mm. Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like, I'm a big fan of point and click adventure games since playing King's Quest to the original Broken Sword and a variety of games. And it's interesting to see a resurgence come because of both mobile, Kickstarter, and all these different platforms coming out. Do you think that, I guess, the genre will continue to flourish a little bit, continue to return, or do you see it as just kind of a niche market that will just come and go, I guess, as it pleases?
Yeah, I think ultimately people, right, if you think 10 years ago, I remember somebody coming up and saying, I used to love being frustrated in adventure games.
Mm-hmm.
I used to love the fact that I didn't know how to move forward, and I'd wake up the next morning and think, I'll try that and it would work. That was gameplay from the 1980s. That was what people liked through to the mid 90s. People are a lot more impatient now. They want to be able to move forward fast.
Mm-hmm.
So we've designed our games, our adventure games, with the objective of, I mean, whether we succeeded or not is a different case, but we've designed our games with the objective of bridging both. So we put a hint system in. If you get stuck, you can go and look for a hint, and it'll give you a gentle suggestion, and then a bit more blatant, and then it'll give you the answer.
Mm-hmm.
So that's our way of overcoming the frustration that a lot of people had. We also work very hard to try and make sure that the puzzles are logical within the context of the story at that time and within the context of the motivation
Mm.
of the characters. So that if you think hard about it, then you should be able to work the solution out. I think the day where the solutions were really obscure
Mm.
and if you're going to be negative, you'd call them contrived,
Mm-hmm.
is probably gone. I think the audience has changed. They want something that they can think through logically, so that if they do get stuck and look it up, then instead of saying to themselves, how could I have worked it out? That it's more, oh gosh, I should have seen it, I should have known, I should have worked it out,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's a very legitimate puzzle when that's their response if they get stuck.
Mm. Um, I'm curious, talking a little bit more now about the game as we're playing it in the background a little bit. Um, obviously this is the fifth entry. I'm sure you talked about this a lot, but what's been your big inspiration for the game and for the
I'm sorry,
series?
what's been the big
Sorry,
what's
what's the
been
big inspiration for the series?
okay. Well, the first game was called Broken Sword One: Shadow of the Templars, and the if I talk briefly about the start, then it might sound familiar.
Hmm.
This American bloke turns up in Paris and hooks up with a sassy French girl who's a journalist,
Hmm.
and they almost get killed in a conspiracy involving the Knights Templar. Now, that is exactly the same as the Da Vinci Code. And just to be absolutely clear, Broken Sword came 5, 6, 7 years before the Da Vinci Code, and our fans are absolutely convinced that Dan Brown
Hmm.
must have played Broken Sword and was inspired.
Hmm.
Now, Dan, if you're listening, I wouldn't make that claim myself because your lawyers are much better paid than mine. But I'm very happy for our fans to make that claim on our behalf.
Hmm.
So that whole that whole history, that Dan Brown did capture extremely successfully in the Da Vinci Code and then Angels and Demons
Hmm.
is kind of fascinating, and it feels very contemporary in regards to narrative and storytelling, and we were there first
Hmm.
with Broken Sword One, and in many ways we sort of defined the zeitgeist, which others then follow and made a lot more money than us, and in terms particularly of books turning into films, but that whole area of biblical references, medieval history. What was interesting about the Templars in many ways was the way that on one hand they were warrior monks. Sorry, on one hand they were warriors. They were fearsome warriors fighting against the Muslims in the Holy Land, helping to keep Jerusalem. But on the others, they were monks,
Hmm.
and they prayed to God, and this sort of conflict between the two created very interesting situations. And historically, of course, they were hugely significant. So um, the history of the Middle East, and the Christianity and Judaism and the Muslim religion, all very much hinged around what was going on at that time. And it was fascinating because the Muslims were actually extremely well educated, knowledgeable, much more so than the Christians, and a lot of knowledge was transferred from the interactions between the Muslims and the Christians. So, for example, a lot of the great Greek works had been lost, but they had been translated by the great scholars, the Muslim scholars, and kept in libraries. So, as the Muslims were defeated, the Muslim armies, particularly in the southern Spain, in places like Toledo, so great swathes of knowledge which had been lost during the Dark Ages got rediscovered. So it was a fascinating time, and I just love the idea that elements of what was going on then would resonate into the modern day. One of the inspirations was a book called Foucault's Pendulum by Umberto Eco, which actually involved involved elements of the Knights Templar mythology. Another one was a book called The Holy Blood and the Holy Grail, which was copied lock, stock, and barrel by well, I better not say that. Let's say Dan Brown took enormous inspiration from it, and used a lot of the elements that they claimed. Now, the fact that what was claimed in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail is utter nonsense, kind of moves across to the Da Vinci Code, because in the Da Vinci Code, one of the opening statements that Dan Brown makes is that it is a fact that the Priory of Sion exists. Actually, Dan, it is utter nonsense. The Priory of Sion was started by a fellow called Pierre Plantard, who claimed to be the Grand Master of multiple secret societies. So it's kind of interesting where truth and fiction lies, and the beginning of these sort of conspiracies that resonated around the internet and continue to do so today. I mean, really being amplified in many ways.
Also, a question about, sorry, as I'm looking through here, it's always interesting when I'm playing these games and trying to ask questions at the same time. Your mind is a little boggled as you're trying to balance both here. I was also curious about generally this game as well. As we're playing some of these introductory sequences, I know you're a big fan of, like you were talking about, researching your games and really giving a lot of historical context. What research did you do for this game in particular, and what did you really look towards as, I guess, historical references and inspiration?
Well, as far as Paris is concerned, I think I have a very romantic view of Paris. I was taken there when I was very young by my mother, and back in those days, we're talking about the early 70s. London was very grimy. There was soot everywhere. I mean, since it's been sandblasted and looks amazing, but in those days it was very poor as well. And our food was very bland. So to go to Paris, this bright city, where the food was extraordinary and people had energy and they had beautiful clothes and they smoked different cigarettes, because in those days everybody smoked, was extraordinary. And my sort of picture postcard view of Paris comes from that. And I hope that people, particularly the French, who see that it's a very romanticized, but it's a very affectionate view of Paris. So one of the things a lot of people do is they ask, they say, I'm going off to Paris, where should we go for a Broken Sword tour? And so I try and make things as authentic as possible. So, clearly, from that particular view in the opening scene, if you go back into the into the gallery, then you've got a view over iconic Paris. Now, there isn't that view. That's not realistic, but you do see the Eiffel Tower and you do see some of those iconic buildings. And if you come back out again and walk to the left, then you will look up at Sacré-Cœur. So the geography is all correct. Indeed, there's some wonderful arcades that we took inspiration from and used as reference. But probably, one of the elements that I want to try and get right is the Middle Eastern history. So I went off to Istanbul. I love Istanbul. I think it's fascinating. I think Turkey is a wonderful country, and I think the people, the Turks, are exceptional. They're very friendly, um, and very very welcoming, very warm. But a friend of mine from the 80s, we developed games together, was Turkish, a guy called Mevlut Dink, and he was back in Istanbul. And I'd read these articles about a place quite close to a city called Urfa,
Mm.
called Tebekli Gepi. I'm mispronouncing it, but it basically means hog's back. And they discovered a man-made encampment there from 15,000 years ago.
Mm.
So it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, human encampments. And it's massive. It's massive, and it had been deliberately buried.
Mm.
And so it kind of feels really interesting. The only problem was that it was on the border with Syria, and the war, that that terrible, terrible war
Mm.
was raging, and border towns were being blown up. So I was a little bit worried to go to Urfa, but Mev was working for Turk Telecom, and we flew into Urfa,
Mm.
and they sent some Turk Telecom vans, and we were just so well treated. We were taken into Urfa, which in the Muslim tradition is where Abraham died,
Mm.
where it's where Job was born and lived. So, from a biblical perspective, it's a really, really important city.
Mm.
And after that, we went then to Gebli Tepe. Forgive my pronunciation; I can't quite
Mm.
remember exactly how it should be pronounced. But this extraordinary place overlooking the plains of Syria,
Mm.
and that was great. And it was lovely to be able to go to Istanbul as well. Um, One of the huge joys and privileges of writing these games is the ability to go and find exciting, go and visit fascinating places and make interesting connections. Which, my view is that if I'm excited by a place and if I'm excited by a background, then hopefully, the players of the game will be too.
Mm. Just out of curiosity, out of a personal question, do you have any documentary footage or do you have any interesting behind the scenes footage of you visiting these places? It sounds like a very interesting trip in general.
No, no. It was all done during the Kickstarter
Got it.
campaign. So we posted photos
Hmm.
and gave a description, but there's no video footage.
Okay.
Um,
Um,
and, and
yeah.
and also, I mean, the tragedy is that I don't think that we would be able to go back now
Mm,
because of the way that the war has escalated
of course.
in such a terrifying way.
Yeah. Um, Focusing a little bit more on the gameplay itself, and I'm just curious, your experience as both a writer and being, the founder and the creator of the company. Um, Looking at this scene especially, and looking at the tutorial, how do you go about designing these scenes? Like, do you think about the story first? Do you think about the gameplay first? How do you balance those two things out as you're creating these, set pieces and puzzles and story
Well,
elements?
that's interesting. Clearly, the gameplay has to win out.
Hmm.
I mean, that's obvious. Um, but the gameplay is driven forward and motivated by the story and the characterization. So what I will do is I'll write a half-page story, and then start thinking about what the great moments are from a gameplay perspective, and the two documents, they're live documents that get expanded, so that the gameplay, sorry, the story, which is effectively a pitch, will then go to 3, 6, and then turn into a full story document of about 20 pages, and that will and one of the key things we want to do is define what the great moments are. So for our Kickstarter campaign, we love the idea of George and Nico in a cable car in Montsegur. Sorry, I beg your pardon, in Montserrat in Spain. And so commissioned artwork to have Nico hanging from the cable car, and George recoiling in a hail of bullets.
Hmm.
And we define those great moments. I mean, the slightly ironic thing, of course, is we found ourselves having to uh, write the story to fit the artwork that we'd done, and then we had to come up with puzzles, and it was fine. It was a very climactic moment in the game, but it was ironic that we came up with this piece of artwork that we used to promote the game,
Mm.
and that became pivotal in both story and gameplay terms, which I wouldn't recommend that you design a game around a piece of artwork, but that's what we did, and I don't think it did any harm.
Mm.
So Having written the story, having written the puzzles to and the characters to drive that, um, the real key thing is to play through or to read through initially, and just make sure that the puzzles feel logical in the context of the situation at that time,
Mm.
as I mentioned earlier, both in terms of the story and in terms of the character motivations. And I hope that we do that well. Obviously, sometimes people feel that puzzles maybe aren't as logical as they should be.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that we get accused of very often, but it's certainly something that we work very hard to try and get right, because ultimately there's an interesting theoretician of film called Robert McKee, and he talks about the way that films should be written,
Mm-hmm.
and he talks about the fact that you put the protagonist under pressure, and that the audience expects them to take one route, but that's blocked, and that then they have to move across. And in many ways, there are many logical similarities to games in that you should create a situation for the character, and obviously the player is then required to work out how to move forward. But in doing so, you should put the character under pressure and um, create fun situations which are unexpected, and that's kind of what we try to do when we write our games, um, so that the narrative progresses as a reward for the player.
Mm.
And if it's going to be a true reward, then the story has to work in the context of the puzzles have to work in the context of the story. If you're going to have mini games, they need to be there rather than just simply to hold the player back, to delay the player, which
Mm.
is so often what people do. They have to be um, relevant. So, for example, in both 4 and 5, we put in cipher puzzles. So as the player deciphers this particular message, so they learn more about the game till ultimately they can then move forward in the game because they fully deciphered the puzzle. That to me, I think, works well because it is within the context of the game.
Mm.
Um, and an example perhaps where it didn't work so well is when we went to director's cut and we put the cipher in. Sorry, we put a lock puzzle in, and it
Mm.
required you to move bars around, and a few people came back and said they felt it wasn't quite as in context with the gameplay as it should have been.
Mm.
And I think that's probably a very good and probably a fair comment.
Mm. Um, what I guess going back to the gameplay elements, what have you kind of gained knowledge of from creating games from Broken Sword 1 all the way now to Broken Sword 5? I noticed a lot of common tropes that you use in Broken Sword 5, but is there anything in particular that you felt that you evolved in terms of your thinking of game design since the beginning when you created Broken Sword 1 and all your earlier games?
Yeah, in many ways, the adventures, say from Broken Sword One. Well, if sorry, let me start again.
Sure.
If you look at our first game, which was called Lyra the Temptress, that was very much a text-based game brought to graphics.
Mm-hmm.
So you could click on one of your characters, your helper character, a guy called Rat Pouch, and you could string commands together. Tell Rat Pouch to, and then all the verbs, go to or pick up or whatever.
Mm.
Go to, and then you'd have a list of any of the rooms that had been visited, and you could get him to do things in those rooms. And that was very exciting, but also limiting. And I feel that we never quite made the most of what we called virtual theatre.
Mm.
And then with our second game, Beneath a Still Sky, which we wrote with a comic book artist called Dave Gibbons, and who wrote Watchmen.
Mm.
He co-created Watchmen with Alan Moore,
Mm.
and drew the comic pages. Very talented guy, really nice guy. And that then you could again see that we were moving away from text interfaces, but still had elements of text. And then Broken Sword One, which was our third game, moved very much into the what has become the standard point and click adventure. And a lot of people say that they use Broken Sword as reference. So we used full icons rather than for subjects when you talk to people, rather than displaying the text.
Mm.
And I have to say, displaying the text still feels a little bit old fashioned to me.
Mhm.
I think what by offering icons, it means that you can talk about you can indicate to the game what you want to talk about, but you don't know exactly how that's going to happen.
Mm.
And in many ways, when we wrote Broken Sword 5, our promise was to go back to Broken Sword 1 and 2 in terms of the interface and in terms of the type of design. So in many ways, Broken Sword 5 did feel like Broken Swords 1 and 2.
Mm.
I would hope it certainly graphically it was a lot more contemporary because it was 1080p rather than 640 480.
Mm.
Obviously, full quality CD, quality audio rather than one of the terrible things about that first game is that we'd had to compress the hell out of all the text so that it could stream from a CD.
Yeah.
In many cases, and those CDs were running at single speed. So we had to compress everything enormously harshly. But it felt very fresh at the time because nothing. I mean, but Beneath the Still Sky was the first adventure game to include audio, full speech,
Mm.
and Broken Sword was just after that. So it was all very fresh and new. So clearly, an audio and a graphics perspective, it's very very it's hugely advanced on what we were able to do previously.
Mm.
As far as the logic of the games, a lot of that is actually very similar because that's what we promised in our Kickstarter campaign.
Mm.
We have. I'm worried to call them mini games because mini games have such a bad reputation,
Mm.
but let's call them close up first person views, which I think feel very well fit very well because as I say they do work in context. So in one of them you are rearranging a shredded letter
Mm.
to work out what had been written. As I say, we had ciphers,
Mm.
we had going into a map scene and decoding a map. And that's not something that we did first time round. And I think it does add to the game
Mm.
because it allows us to feel, particularly on the touch, much more tactile. But you go into the view of the protagonist, into the player character, and I think it allows us to convey things in a slightly different way, in a slightly more advanced way.
Mm.
But broadly, the approach was what we promised was that it was going to feel classical, and that's very much what we delivered.
Mm. One more question about Broken Sword before we get to our final questions. The series is known for its sarcastic humor and its witty dialogue. What made you decide to include that in the original games, I guess, and continue to revisit them over and over?
Well, I think we can thank probably King's Quest for that
Hmm.
because, of course, we were great fans of the Sierra games. There were some really great games, and but the one thing was that Roberta Williams, who clearly was the creative brains behind Sierra,
Mm.
and a very talented lady, uh, but my God, she took herself seriously. So those King's Quest games, where you've got King Graham of Daventry,
Mm.
and enormous cutscenes, and we were kind of responding to that. We wanted to write something that didn't take itself too seriously,
Mm.
and we were founded at around about the same time as LucasArts actually, and
Mm.
in many ways their view was the same as ours, except they went down the slapstick route,
Mm.
and we went down the serious route with witty dialogue, um, and and I think it was the right thing. I think just being serious for in a film, you watch it, it's an hour and a half. That's great. If you're going to play a game, to be deadly serious without any humor,
Mm.
you've got to get it absolutely spot on. I think what I wanted to do was, knowing that people would play the game for 8, 9, 10 hours, was to vary the pacing and also vary the approach through, on one hand, being serious, and on the other, to have the humor.
Mm.
And broadly, I think it works. It works well. I'm and as do our fans, and that's something that we've tried to maintain all the way through.
Mm. Um, I guess going now a little more broadly speaking, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the next few years in gaming. What are you looking forward to? What are you hoping either gets better or improves for the gaming industry in general?
Well, the big change was, just to allude to the launch of iPhone.
Mm,
The big change obviously came, in 2008,
mm,
when Apple absolutely blew away a pretty rotten, for developers, a pretty rotten system,
yeah.
where handset manufacturers were squabbling with airtime providers and everybody else, and publishers, and it was almost impossible to recoup as a developer.
Mm,
Um, and the classic case was Broken Sword 3, which earned our publisher at the time, THQ, $5-6 million,
mm,
and we made a substantial loss. So something had to change if we were going to continue writing games, and that change really came from the ability to publish directly, which is what Apple offered. And Apple offered a 70% revenue, so they would take 30%
mm,
for all the work that they did, which is very substantial in providing the store, in selling the apps, and collecting revenues. And then that was followed by Steam, who offer a very similar um, offer, and then obviously Google with Google Play
mm,
on Android. So that is from a business perspective, it's made it feasible to write games, which it was rapidly becoming unfeasible
mm,
in our particular genre, the adventure genre.
mm,
So in many ways, I just hope that continues, because it suits the large publishers to wrap the market up. Of course, it does. They had a choke point both at on funding of games, and then in distribution through to retail,
mm,
which with digital has now been lost. Um, I hope that the publishing environment that Apple and Google and Steam, and Good Old Games, and others have created for independent developers stays benign, because it's fantastic. It's great. We
mm,
have the opportunity to earn significant revenues when our games are successful. We have the opportunity to liaise and communicate directly with our audience, which is fantastic.
mm,
There's a lot of really good things. I know a lot of people, as I said, complained about Apple, but those people who are complaining about Apple were not trying to write games 10, 15 years ago, when
mm,
it was a very, very difficult environment.
mm,
Clearly, social media continues to expand and become more powerful, and that works for us very well. The rise of Twitch um, would not have been foreseen 5, 6 years ago, and it's fantastic that we can have a conversation like this live, and that it can then be
mm.
broadcast afterwards.
Yeah.
You know, and perhaps it's through social media, perhaps it's through channels like Twitch, that the greatest changes are going to happen. I don't know.
Mm. Um, and just out of curiosity, for your work, what is next for Revolution and you?
Right. I am in a wonderful position. Revolution is we follow a studio system, in like the Hollywood filmmaking method, where we will grab together a team when we go into production. We
Mm,
will open big offices, and we'll have great fun. And then at the end of it, we close right back down again, and people work from home offices. So
mm,
we expand and contract, and that basically takes the pressure off to have to go straight into production. What would have happened under the model that I had previously, where we had 30, 40, 50 people,
mm,
is that there was huge pressure on me at the end of a project, because that's when obviously it needs all the attention. But to try and make sure that the team would have something to go on to, I was having to write new games as well, and it just wasn't fun. It
mm,
just took all the fun out of it. So by going to this new model, where we're working with a core team, and then pulling people on a freelance basis, it means that actually I can sit back and work on prototypes. And we're currently working on a prototype that is nothing to do with Broken Sword, or any of our other franchises,
mm,
and that may or may not come to anything. And we're talking to Dave Gibbons about working on a new project with him, possibly a new Beneath a Steel Sky.
mm,
That's yet to be decided. And of course, I would love to do a new Broken Sword as well. But that's Broken Swords tend to come every 5 years, so I'm not in an enormous hurry.
mm.
But the success of Broken Sword 5 fills us with confidence. It's a great position to be in.
No, definitely. It sounds like you're keeping
Sorry,
busy. Oh, go ahead.
and I've totally failed to answer your question.
Oh, it's okay.
Um, but one of the reasons why I failed to answer your question only is because it's very
hmm
naive to talk about too much.
hmm
In that, if I say this is what we're working on, this is what we're going to deliver, and then we don't,
hmm
then then it creates false expectations, which is never a good idea.
hmm No, I understand. But it does sound like you're at least staying very busy within the potential projects you might be working on.
Yeah,
So
no, very much so, very much so. Yeah.
very cool. Two more questions I have for you before we wrap this up. One question from the Twitch stream. They were just wondering if you were working on any new platforms, whether it's VR, AR, the new Nintendo platform, anything like that.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the short answer is no.
Mm,
Um, VR is very, very well served at the moment. It's not at all clear whether Oculus will win or whether the Steam VR will win
mm,
or Morpheus, and they all work slightly differently. So as people probably know, the Oculus is a seated experience. The Steam is one where generally you'd expect to wander around. Totally different types of games,
mm,
and they will deliver a completely different experience. And so I think it's great for companies and developers that got in early. We didn't because we were focusing on Broken Sword 5 and the more mainstream formats. So while I love VR and I think I love augmented reality
mm,
ARG even more,
mm,
it's something that we are playing around with and considering, but it's not something that we're actively working on at the moment.
mm,
And as far as Nintendo, um, the answer is no because
mm,
um, uh, because we're moving on to Broken Sword 5 is not going to come out. Well, certainly for the time being, it's not something we're actively pursuing.
mm,
But going forward, everything is open because the games that we write tend to be able to port across the different platforms. And we'll see at the time. But at the moment, we're not actively working on VR, ARG, or Nintendo platforms.
mm. And then my final question to you is just about aspiring game developers. I know you teach a little bit. I know you've been mentoring other aspiring game developers. What's a big tip that you give them in terms of if they wanted to create a game in this environment nowadays?
Well, I'm not sure how helpful this is.
Mm,
The example I like to give is Angry Birds,
mm,
which used a public domain physics engine.
mm,
And so my argument to them is that as long as they're happy to develop in their own time and on minimal monies, and it's always possible to get a little bit of money from places, prototype funds, particularly in the UK, then Angry Birds could have been written by a very talented graphic artist, a very talented very talented game designer,
mm,
and a mediocre programmer. Three people could have produced Angry Birds, a prototype for Angry Birds, in a very short time, in 3 or 4 months.
mm,
And so what I urge people is to really come up with their own demos and as cheaply as possible, but as impressively as possible, and then
mm,
the chances of it taking off in the way Angry Birds did is of course low. But as an experienced developer, what we love is seeing people's games when they come to us,
mm,
and that's always the most amazing thing, to see a game, to see the passion, to see the new ideas. Um, but ultimately, if you don't succeed, then it's probably not a bad idea to work for an existing developer. I know everybody wants to start their own company and set the world alight and change the world, and that's great, and some people can.
mm,
Um, but I do recommend that people try and work with an experienced developer for at least a bit of time because they'll learn an awful lot. They'll make contacts,
mm,
and I think it'll give them a better context in which to then go forward with their own project. So, I was lucky enough to get involved with the industry when it was right at the very beginning, so there was very little competition.
mhm,
But I very purposefully went and worked for publishers because I wanted to learn from their perspective, and I learned an awful lot from US Gold, and then even more from Activision. And I think that helped me enormously when I came back and started Revolution,
mm,
because I could see it from a different perspective. I would urge young developers to seriously consider working for larger developers, like maybe even working for publishers, or maybe even working for magazines or websites, so that they can get a different perspective.
Mm.
Because otherwise, it's very easy to produce iterations of what's gone before, rather than real game-changing games.
Mm. Okay, awesome. And I think I didn't want to take up too much of your time, but thank you so much for taking the time to spend it with us. Playing a little bit of Broken Sword 5 and just speaking with us about your career and your game history.
Well, thank you, and you've got past the first section. You're, I think, quite close to finishing the second section, so you haven't done too badly in that time. So, congratulations for that, and it's been great talking to you. It's been a privilege, and thank you for listening and for asking interesting questions.
Definitely. And for everyone that's interested in the game is out, I believe, on all mobile platforms, Google Play, iOS, and Steam, correct?
That's correct. Yes, and well. It's PC, Mac, and Linux.
Hmm.
It's Xbox One and PlayStation 4. It's Android version on Steam on Google Play, and then the PC version and then the Apple version obviously on Apple, and then from a PC and Mac perspective, it's available on Steam and Good Old Games
Mm.
and some other formats as well. So it's pretty widely available depending on the platform that you prefer to play it on.
That's a mouthful to say.
Yes, no, absolutely.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you. We can't wait to see your next game, and thank you for taking the time once again.